I'm not a blogger. I just feel like telling you my story of half Russian, half Ukrainian guy. I raised in Moscow, although I was frequently coming on the summertime to my grandparents who lived in Lviv. That's the capital of Western Ukraine. And you know what? That was a perfect childhood. We mingled. We never cared about who speaks Russian or who speaks Ukrainian. That's, by the way, what I put in my first book entitled This World is Built on Lies. The hyperlink to this book, which is sold on Amazon, will be underneath, right? So, what would the ethnic heritage among Lviv citizens? Absolute majority was obviously Ukrainian, speaking Ukraine, with a so-called Western accent. And by the way, I'm fluent in Ukrainian, exactly in the Western, applying Western accent. But there were like a lot of Russians, never cared, never, no one actually blamed them for not being able to speak Ukrainian. And some Ukrainians spoke Russian, so. Also, there was some community of Polish people. They were pretty much separated. They walked by themselves. Although in my company, we did have a couple of Polish, a girl and her brother. So they were Polish. And was also one guy, he was Jewish, but he spoke Russian. Jewish usually didn't speak Ukrainian that much. They preferred to speak Russian. So it's very much mixed heritage, pretty much like was in Yugoslavia. Those small nations, they coexisted for ages. They very much used to seeing other people around them. So basically, that was not a big deal until some external force overpowered. It took one side and tried to push against the other side. So without that external force, I think it would be decades, many more years that when these people would coexist without any problem. Because this is the same heritage, same, their parents, they studied in Soviet Union schools. They studied same subjects, so there were not any particular reason for the hatred. And basically what happened is the eastern part of Ukraine, they mostly spoke Russian. And it entailed Donbass, Lugansk, Crimea, by the way, and Mariupol, so basically all the way from the east to the southeast. In the year of 1954, then president of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, he issued a decree passing formerly Russian lands, including Crimea, to Ukraine as a sign of solidarity of the two nations. That was, again, 1954. Up until the collapse of the Soviet Union and disintegration, there was not a big deal at all because it was the same culture, same, like everything was pretty much the same. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, that eastern part, along the west, along the south, they ethnically identified them as Russians, although they didn't mind to live within the boundaries of Ukraine up until a certain point. And I'll explain you what happened. Before the 2008, Ukraine was actually ahead of Russia in terms of integrating with the West. I was traveling frequently there, and I was noticing how fastly the infrastructure is developing. The roads, the pavement was actually better than that in Russia. Smooth roads, Western attitude at the shops, some luxuries like air conditioners, the sanitary installation within the hotel room, etc. But somehow, after the financial crisis, Ukraine, which was part of their elected presidents, were reliant on Europe in terms of their developments rather than on Moscow. That's how they decided. But this is just a part of the story, because uh, it's like pretty much like in the United States, Democratic Party and Republican Party. So they change each other, and one party tilts towards one things, another party tilts towards like more social things, but all in all, they can peacefully coexist. Same was applicable in the situation with Ukraine. One president tilted towards Ukrainians, but next elections, he is superseded by another president who is more inclined to follow the Easterners' interests. But they coexisted. They were, up until, as I said, one point, never had any problem with agreeing with each other. It was a fractional structure of the Ukrainian parliament, so-called Party of Regions. They represented people in eastern parts and southeast parts, whereas more traditional parties, they represented people from the west. Again, there was no any conflict with that. They coexisted. And the parliament was like shared among representatives of each party. But somehow I started to see that Ukraine started to decelerate in its development beginning year 2008. Apparently, Europe was deep inside its own troubles following the financial crisis, collapse of mortgage banks. You know that story about hyper real estate in Germany and Northern Rock in England, etc. So they apparently didn't have time or aspiration to help Ukraine or anything. They were deep inside their problems. That's how Ukraine started to defeat, to lose actually, to development of Russia, because Russia never relied on, well, it did under Yeltsin, but Yeltsin was a long time gone, and he was even deceased by that time. So Russia was just mostly relying on itself, on the natural resources, etc. And by the year of 2012, the underdevelopment of Ukraine became very much visual and apparent as compared to Russia. Many Ukrainians were relocating to Russia, chasing for better opportunities to higher paid jobs. And in fact, the average salary in Russia was like 3 times or 2 times at least as high as average salary in Ukraine. That's why this outflow was mostly to the east, and some western regions, they prefer to come to Poland. But then all of a sudden that escalation started, and the NATO naval ships, they obviously tried to pursue to establish a naval base in Crimea, despite the Crimea was rented by Russia, by Kremlin from Ukraine. It was the official agreement that Russia will preserve its naval forces in the Crimea. There is nowhere basically to let this naval forces apart the place, the Crimea Peninsula. You just can physically move it anywhere, because it's like several dozen of heavy ships, of air carriers, air flight carriers, etc. So yeah, that was the case. But starting in the year 2009, repeated attempts were undertaken by NATO to establish a naval base in the Crimea Peninsula, just disregarding that treaty between Ukraine and Russia. And I spoke with one of the taxi men back then, when I was coming, and he told me a typical story when people were just throwing stones at the NATO naval ships, saying "Go away." Nobody forced them to do that. There was no any directive from Kremlin or just like instructions how to behave when they were pushed. It just was like a general feeling of these people who lived there for ages. They just didn't understand how the NATO ships would be moored next to Russian ships in Sevastopol. Apparently, that could only happen if they had a common agreement, military agreement with Russian forces. So maybe like rendering common military exercises, something like that. But they never asked. They just used the opportunity of Black Sea being neutral territory, and they were just using Black Sea and trying repeatedly to moor to establish a naval base there. It's not. I mean, I am not the one to judge how honest it was, how fair, but it was the case. Everyone can tell you so if you travel to Crimea or you just speak to like people who live there. All in all, that developed in certain contradiction between Ukrainians who just represented the NATO interest in, particularly in the eastern regions, because NATO somehow it was not interested to establish its bases in western part of Ukraine, like Lviv or Ternopil or anywhere, but it tilted towards establishing bases close to the Russian border. I don't know again why. So if they really wanted to establish a naval base, that was Ismail port. Also, it was typically Ukrainian. Ismail was just barely under Russia, unlike Odessa, unlike Sevastopol and other typical destination where Russia was reigning for several centuries under Peter the Great and on. So I don't want to get deep into history. You just can Google it if you want. But the thing is, when the coup happened in February 2014, coup d'etat. But obviously, it was coup d'etat, nothing. We cannot qualify it any other way. But basically, what happened? Yanukovych, then president of Ukraine, he was exactly in favor of eastern part, so he was like party of region representative, but he's tried to negotiate with Kremlin, with Putin, and at the same time he tried to negotiate with Brussels, with the West. How these two parties could coexist? It was apparently an uncharted borders, but he actually did something, but he evoked hatred because Westerners suspected him of following Moscow interests. But it was only like 1 year before the Ukrainian elections. So without this external shock, they were ready to wait until the next election. And I think he was non-re-electable. It was just a matter of patience for one year, and another president would step in, like the one who preceded Yanukovych. His name was Yushchenko, and he was largely in favor of Western interests. But somehow, people from the State Department, like Victoria Nuland and other, like it was a mutiny, it was a coup d'etat, obviously. She supported the rebels. It was pretty much like January 6th in the United States. It was as if the rebels captured the Capitol Hill, but instead of imprisoning them for trying to overthrow the current legitimate power, they would capture the Capitol Hill, establish their own government, and Nancy Pelosi would just grab her laptop under her arm and escape to, let's say, to Canada. It's difficult to imagine, right? So, but it's how the events developed back then. And whatever funny or ridiculous it sounds, it was not fun at all, because the legitimate president was forced to flee, to escape to the neighboring region of Russia. And he was chased. He was announced a person under persecution in his home country. And they installed a president, just a president installed. He was a puppet, of course, President Poroshenko. He was not elected, he was installed, basically. But that's how the thing started to develop. And that pretty much reminds me of the events in Yugoslavia, because like people who was in charge in Serbia somehow like new political figures uh, like Hashi. I don't remember exactly his well, never mind. So pretty much the same, like puppet government, but it was in favor of West countries, and that's how the whole opposition started. And the situation was like they Crimea, Putin did something, but he didn't do the thing following that logic. He obviously declared it Crimea part of Russia, and it was orchestrated, obviously, the whole thing about voting. But people there, nevertheless, they tended to join Russia. So whenever you come there and ask people if they were willing to join Russia on Ukraine, they said, yeah, we would be with Russia because we feel Russian, although we feel sorry about the situation, but just because the whole stuff happened, we would not think twice. We would join Russia. But people in eastern parts like Donbass and Lugansk, they repeatedly knocked Kremlin doors and said, "Listen, we're same people as there, but down there in Crimea. We want to join Russia." But Putin, he said, no, it would not be legitimate. The West would not recognize, because it would be a seizure of territory from Ukraine. So he insisted that these two regions become autonomous from the rest of Ukraine, and that's what we called Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements was in Minsk, in the capital of Belarus, and it was back in 2014, and they agreed basically that the Eastern Territory will be autonomous, and so they will be they will have the right to elect their own local representatives. So the scheme was pretty much resembling the same as happened in Georgia and Southern Ossetia and Abkhazia. So these two regions, Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia, they right now kind of autonomous. They are not true states because they're microscopic territories, but they're independent from both. They carry their own currency, they carry their own government, they carry their own, car plates. But they just separated from Georgia. They decided to live by their own. So the same scheme was intended for people in Donbass and Lugansk. These people intended to be fully autonomous, to be under protectorate of Ukraine, but live by themselves, to be able to install. Ukraine obviously against it because it was considered to be a separatist movement, and was right that it's absolutely true that since 2014, Donetsk essentially, and Lugansk, these two cities were constantly exposed to shelling from side of Ukraine, and people happened to be killed. That's for sure. And so this is the bright illustration how external power gets inside local conflicts, like in Yugoslavia. I don't know what happened. Yeah, guys. I'm not the one to judge how deep were contradictions between Shia and Sunni, but I know that in Yugoslavia they could peacefully coexist. Albanians with Serbians could peacefully coexist with many decades, at least That's what they tell us. Same thing here. The Western Ukraine would peacefully coexist with Eastern Ukraine and obviously take advantage of being both in good relations with Moscow and in the West. So Ukraine, in that case, would have a very special geopolitical situation, reaping fruit from good relationship with the West and with Moscow. But the history turned upside down, and they artificially created enemies out of people in the East and in the West. And since 2014, which is obviously right, the shelling continued. Putin, and then we see the character of Putin. So he suddenly realized that the West is like mocking at him. He's just making fun of the whole situation, of the Minsk agreements, or on all stuff like that. And as soon as he realized that, and President Biden started to build heavy artillery and shelling intensified towards the eastern part, he just declared just recognized this republic without Minsk agreement. And that's how the whole thing, again, after the year of 2008, I came back to Ukraine. I was like frequently traveling there, and it was apparent for me that Ukraine stalled in its development. They used, for example, in Kiev, same metro cars as was built under USSR, where in Moscow it was already a third generation of metro cars. They looked very much different, I think. So I think many people were naive, supposing that America can change legislation quickly, that it can adapt to the modern reality, that it can be flexible towards Ukraine, towards like Yugoslavia, as approach to Moscow. It can be more negotiable in terms of common military projects. It couldn't simply happen because this is the way American politics works. Well, thank you for